It happens quietly, mid-sentence, mid-movement, when the world you thought you knew wavers. The colors don't change, yet something inside them does. The floor beneath awareness softens, time stretches, and the body forgets how to trust its own balance. For a breath, everything looks the same but feels impossibly distant, like watching life through clear water. This isn't exhaustion, nor is it imagination. It's the split second when the brain's map stops matching the territory, the first signal that perception itself is about to rewrite its rules, and once you notice it, reality will never feel as solid again. The first time it happens, it's almost invisible. A single second of vertigo, a microfracture in the ordinary flow of perception. You tell yourself it's just stress, a momentary flicker of anxiety. But something deeper is occurring, a structural glitch in how your brain stabilizes reality. Neuroscientists call it predictive instability, the brief moment when your internal model of the world no longer matches what your senses deliver. Inside your skull, millions of micro-predictions run every second. They keep the world feeling solid. Every sight, every sound, every familiar face, all of them are predictions being confirmed over and over. It's a system so seamless that you mistake it for truth. Yet, when one small thread of that fabric loosens, the entire weave trembles. You don't see the world collapsing. You feel it losing weight, like gravity has thinned between perception and meaning. The danger lies in misinterpreting this shift. Most people file it under panic or fatigue. They try to anchor themselves with logic, breath, distraction. But ignoring it doesn't stop the process. It accelerates it. Because what's truly happening isn't emotional. It's computational. The brain, facing conflicting data, begins a reorganization. It questions its own map. And when a map questions itself, direction disappears for a while. There's a silent alarm embedded in this moment, a biological warning that perception is approaching a threshold. The cortex, usually confident in its guesses, enters a feedback loop. Am I still predicting correctly? This loop burns energy. You feel it as unease, derealization, or sudden disconnection from your surroundings. The walls still exist, the sounds still reach you, but your sense of belonging to them flickers. The self becomes slightly transparent. You might think this is a malfunction. In truth, it's an initiation into a rarer layer of awareness, but only if approached correctly. The fatal error isn't the instability itself, it's the refusal to listen. When you fight the softening of reality, your nervous system doubles down on control. The mind tightens its grip, demanding certainty, even as the data changes underneath it. This tension, between what was real and what's now emerging, is the birthplace of perceptual dissonance. Imagine a musician who keeps playing the same note while the orchestra has already shifted key. That's the brain in predictive error. The sound isn't wrong, it's outdated, and if you keep forcing it, the harmony collapses. The same happens internally. A once synchronized perception becomes noise. You begin doubting your own senses, then your choices, then your purpose. Every micro-hesitation compounds. Every attempt to make it normal again increases the static. Scientists observing brain scans during moments like this notice a fascinating signature, a temporary drop in alpha coherence, the rhythm that synchronizes sensory input with prediction. It's as if the conductor has stepped away. The mind, for a brief instant, becomes a stage of unsupervised musicians. Some interpret this as chaos, others as the first pulse of new order forming underneath. But whichever it is, pretending it's nothing is what turns a recalibration into confusion. So the real risk isn't the flicker, it's your instinct to shut it down. Because when you suppress predictive instability, you also suppress adaptation. You tell your brain, do not update, even as reality demands it. Over time, this creates behavioral echoes, resistance to change, obsessive interpretation, emotional fatigue. You start living half a step behind the present, reacting to what used to be instead of what is. The sense of purpose thins, not from lack of meaning, but from a perceptual lag. The moment demands honesty, not panic. Something in you is trying to reconcile two worlds, the one your mind built and the one unfolding now. If you can stay long enough inside that tension without naming it fear, you'll notice it carries information. The instability is data. It's the system signaling an update is ready. And somewhere just beneath that message there's another, the one that almost no one hears until too late. There's a misalignment forming. Silent, precise, and forbidden in the sense that your mind is programmed not to notice it. It's what we'll explore next, the subtle disconnection between perception and reality that starts everything. There's a moment, subtle enough to pass unnoticed, when your perception and reality begin to drift apart. Not dramatically, but by micrometers. The world still looks the same, but its texture feels slightly off, as if light itself has changed viscosity. You keep functioning, speaking, deciding, but something inside you knows the map no longer fits the territory. That quiet tension, the hum beneath consciousness, is the signature of what neuroscientists would call a silent misalignment, a gap between what your predictive brain expects and what the sensory field is actually presenting. It's not a hallucination, it's precision error. Every brain at every moment is forecasting reality milliseconds ahead of real time. That's how you catch a ball, read a face, finish a sentence before it's spoken. Yet when that forecasting system meets data it can't reconcile, it hesitates. The prediction falters, and in that hesitation a strange quiet appears, like static lowering after a burst of noise. Most people mistake this silence for calm or fatigue. In truth, it's the neural equivalent of a compass losing north. You might notice it as a delay. Someone's expression seems disconnected from their words. Your reflection looks slightly foreign. Your memory of what just happened feels slippery. The misalignment hides in these micro-glitches, small enough to doubt yourself for even noticing. But that doubt is the camouflage. The brain doesn't want to admit the mismatch, because acknowledging it would mean rebuilding its predictive model, and that consumes energy. So instead it smooths the error, telling you nothing's wrong. Meanwhile, deeper circuits whisper, something no longer fits. If you could see your brain at that moment, you'd find tiny storms in the sensory cortices, regions arguing over what's real. The visual field says one thing, the emotional field says another, and the predictive engine in the prefrontal cortex tries to mediate. It's not a breakdown, but a negotiation. And every negotiation leaves a trace, slight detachment, faint unreality, a feeling that your own presence has thinned by half a degree. This is the silent part, not because it's absent of sound, but because it hides under the noise of normality. The misalignment often starts where emotion meets logic. You know what you should feel, yet the body doesn't comply. You smile, but it doesn't register internally. You say you understand, but comprehension feels secondhand. That fracture between conceptual alignment and embodied truth widens imperceptibly each time it's ignored. Over days, months, sometimes years, it becomes a subtle distortion field. Perception filtered through prediction rather than through direct encounter. You start living inside the echo of reality, not its source. And here's the paradox. The brain, designed to protect coherence, becomes its own saboteur. Each time it smooths over a small perceptual discrepancy, it trades accuracy for comfort. It's like a pilot recalibrating instruments mid-flight, but refusing to look out the window. The journey continues, but navigation drifts. Eventually, when the gap becomes wide enough, reality pushes back, often through those sudden sensations of unreality or emotional dissonance. The correction feels like collapse, but it's simply the system trying to synchronize again. There's a way to sense this drift before it widens. It's not through analysis, but attention, a particular kind of noticing that doesn't rush to label. When something feels off, most minds immediately diagnose: tired, anxious, distracted. But if you stay in the raw observation, the taste of the air, the rhythm of your pulse, the grain of light on the wall, you begin to detect the exact contour of the misalignment. The present moment becomes strangely tactile. Reality reintroduces itself not as concept, but as contact. The real function of the silent misalignment isn't to confuse you, it's to invite reconfiguration. Like a musical instrument detecting that one of its strings has slipped out of tune, your system is alerting you to recalibrate. But calibration requires awareness, not resistance. Every time you pause and sense, without fixing, without naming, you're allowing predictive error to surface, giving the mind a chance to learn again. Still, the question lingers: what exactly triggers this misalignment? Why does the brain, after years of synchrony, suddenly lose its internal compass? There's a deeper mechanism, one hidden in the split second when prediction collapses entirely, a moment so brief it can only be felt, not measured. That's the hinge point, the exact instant when your perception decides whether to return to stability or to rewrite its own rules. And it's there in that fraction of a second, where everything begins to shift again. Your brain doesn't see the world, it predicts it. Every color, every word you hear, every heartbeat you think you feel, none of them arrive as raw information. They arrive as guesses, refined and corrected in real time. The moment you experience reality losing solidity is the moment that guessing machine fails, even briefly. And when it does, something extraordinary happens. You stop living 1 millisecond ahead of the present and meet the raw data of existence without the filter of expectation. It feels unsettling because the brain is a creature of efficiency, not truth. It prefers familiarity over accuracy. When the predictive system suddenly realizes its forecasts don't fit, a small alarm triggers inside the anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for error detection. It sends a signal that says something doesn't add up. Your body translates that signal as unease, disorientation, the pulse of unreality behind your ribs. You interpret it as danger, but the body interprets it as discovery. That is the tension. The same signal that means threat also means update. The brain can't tell the difference at first. To it, new information and danger feel identical, and so the entire organism tightens, waiting to decide which interpretation will win. If fear dominates, perception collapses inward. You retreat into mental noise. If curiosity manages to hold even a fragment of space, something else unfolds. A micro-reward, a quiet release of dopamine and acetylcholine that tells the system, keep exploring. It's the body's way of saying, yes, uncertainty is uncomfortable, but there's data here. That's the hidden paradox of predictive instability. It carries within it a built-in relief mechanism. Right after the peak of tension, a moment of subtle clarity often follows. Time dilates slightly. The air feels sharper. Your hearing broadens. You're not hallucinating. You're perceiving without compression. It's the cognitive equivalent of taking off sunglasses you didn't realize you were wearing. For a fraction of a second, perception updates itself to full resolution before the predictive engine reasserts control and rebuilds a simplified model. Most people miss that micro-reward entirely because they're still fighting the instability, trying to get back to normal. But if you can stay attentive through the tremor, the brain reveals its own recalibration process. It's like catching the moment a computer refreshes its internal code. Nothing dramatic, but deeply foundational. The network reassigns meaning, deciding which sensory signals to trust again. You may feel your awareness click into a different register. Sounds become layered, depth perception alters, memory links rearrange themselves in real time. It's both subtle and unmistakable. From a neuroscientific view, this brief relief corresponds to a shift from beta to alpha-theta rhythms, an oscillatory transition that marks a movement from active control to receptive adaptation. The mind stops predicting for a second and starts listening. You might recognize it as a thin line of peace, woven through the unease, a kind of lucidity that doesn't cancel fear, but holds it gently. That is the micro-reward, a flash of coherence born inside instability. Think of it as the nervous system testing a new kind of gravity. It has released the old coordinate system, but hasn't yet stabilized the new one. Everything feels lighter, not because the world has changed, but because the scaffolding of assumption has loosened. In that loosened state, perception can actually learn. The reward doesn't come from pleasure. It comes from truth aligning more closely with sensory input. The system momentarily tastes accuracy. This is why people sometimes describe such moments as heightened reality or expanded awareness. They are touching the interval between collapse and reorganization, and the more consciously you can inhabit that interval, the more gracefully your predictive system will evolve. The mistake is assuming that clarity must feel calm. In fact, clarity often feels electric, even frightening, because it exposes the scaffolding you didn't know was there. You can observe this in something as simple as breath. When predictive tension spikes, notice how the body shortens its exhale, trying to control sensation. If, instead, you lengthen the breath and direct attention toward the raw detail of what's occurring, the texture of your clothing, the hum in the air, the faint gravity beneath your feet, the system begins to stabilize itself. You're giving the predictive brain fresh input to recalibrate with, and every time it succeeds, even slightly, it rewards you with a trace of quiet euphoria. That's the hidden design of the process: instability as doorway, curiosity as stabilizer, micro-reward as teacher. Each time the prediction fails and reorganizes, the system becomes more refined, more sensitive to nuance, less dependent on habit. What once felt like the edge of disintegration becomes a threshold of precision. And if you stay with it long enough, another pattern emerges, a deeper layer of instability, one that doesn't just occur in bursts, but lingers like a low frequency beneath perception. It's the next stage, where cracks begin to widen and familiar certainties start to distort at their core. Once predictive instability begins, it rarely stays contained. The system doesn't simply recover and move on. It tries to compensate. The brain, desperate to restore order, begins accelerating its pattern-matching mechanisms. Every detail becomes potential data, every silence a clue. You start reading into tones, glances, pauses in conversation. What was once background becomes foreground. It feels as if the world has turned its volume up by a fraction, yet clarity hasn't increased, only intensity. This is the first sign that the dissonance is deepening. When predictive failure repeats itself, it leaves micro cracks in perception. At first, they're imperceptible, but over time the cracks start linking. They alter the way sensory information is weighted, how much value you assign to what you see, hear, and intuit. One day you realize you've stopped trusting automatic things, the meaning of a friend's expression, the tone of your own voice, even the feeling that your thoughts originate inside you. The structure of certainty that once held your reality steady begins to flex under pressure. The danger here is subtle. The more the mind tries to repair, the more distortion it introduces. The predictive system doubles down, seeking coherence where there's only change. It builds temporary scaffolds, beliefs, rationalizations, stories, to hold the world still. But each scaffold is slightly misaligned, and the more it piles up, the more fragile the construct becomes. You end up living inside an overfitted model of reality, one that feels more like simulation than presence. Neuroscientifically, this phase corresponds to the brain's overactivation of salience networks, the circuits responsible for determining what deserves attention. Under stress, they misfire, flagging neutral details as significant. You start noticing patterns that may not exist. It's not delusion, it's the system inflating its own sensitivity in an effort to predict more accurately. Ironically, that inflation increases noise, not accuracy. The world seems hyper-detailed but contextless, full of meaning but lacking anchor. The self, in turn, becomes a reactive node, chasing coherence that keeps dissolving the moment it's found. Behaviorally, this manifests as a quiet exhaustion, a vigilance that never turns off. You might find yourself scanning for cues, trying to sense the next fracture before it arrives. It's a kind of perceptual hypervigilance that masquerades as awareness but is actually defense. The body stays alert but not alive. Muscles tense without reason, thoughts loop, small decisions feel weighted with consequence. The brain is trying to prevent another collapse by preempting every possibility. But perception wasn't designed to live in constant prediction. It was designed to flow. There's an emotional toll in this overdrive. The nervous system begins to doubt its own feedback. Are you reacting or perceiving? Is the unease coming from the outside or inside? This confusion erodes intuition. The signals that once guided you, subtle knowing, felt sense, embodied clarity, start to sound distorted, as if playing through a detuned instrument. You begin to mistrust even the guidance that could stabilize you. That mistrust creates a loop of self-surveillance. Every thought is examined, every feeling second-guessed. In this loop, purpose dissolves not because it disappears, but because it becomes overanalyzed to death. And yet, beneath the chaos, something evolutionary is happening. The system is being forced to rebuild from a deeper logic, one that can hold contradiction without collapsing. The instability is stretching your perceptual boundaries, testing how much uncertainty you can metabolize without breaking. In this sense, risk escalation isn't punishment, it's calibration through intensity. But the calibration burns. It strips away layers of assumed truth until only direct experience remains. That's why it feels like identity loss. The old predictive frameworks that once defined who you were can't survive this level of sensory recalibration. If you watch closely, you'll notice that as the cracks widen, time itself feels altered. Moments elongate or compress unpredictably. Ordinary sounds acquire a strange emotional texture. Memory begins to feel less like a timeline and more like a liquid, reshaping itself around whatever state of awareness you inhabit. These distortions are not madness. They're markers that the predictive grid is being rewritten. The mind is trying to establish a new baseline of coherence. But before it stabilizes, it must pass through the corridor of amplified sensitivity, where every signal is both information and interference. This is the critical juncture where most people either close down or awaken further. The system can no longer rely on old predictions. It must learn to integrate in real time, to reforge trust directly through experience instead of through assumption. That's the razor's edge. Resist, and you fracture. Yield, and you evolve. Yet yielding doesn't mean surrendering into chaos. It means learning the precise moment when perception tries to rewrite itself, the instant between breakdown and reassembly. That fraction of a second, hidden in the blur of awareness, determines the direction of the entire process. And soon that's exactly where we'll go, the exact moment that decides whether your reality returns to its former solidity or begins to reorganize into something entirely new. There's a fraction of time, so brief it escapes language, when the brain must decide whether to restore its old version of reality or to rewrite it entirely. It's not mystical, though it feels that way. It's neural physics, perception balancing between two states of coherence. This is the exact moment where the world either snaps back into its previous rhythm or begins pulsing with an unfamiliar clarity that never quite fades again. Most people don't catch it. It's too fast, too quiet. It happens between two frames of perception, when predictive stability fails and the sensory field floods the mind with raw data. The world seems to shimmer, not visually, but in meaning. Your sense of I hesitates. You're still here, yet not quite the same. The old narrative pauses, the new one hasn't yet formed. That pause is not absence, it's potential in its purest state. In neuroscience, this is the microsecond when top-down processing yields to bottom-up input. Your predictions stop dictating, and the sensory world starts leading. The brain's hierarchy inverts. Instead of filtering the world through expectation, it lets the world instruct it directly. It's a radical handover of control. For that split second, you're not predicting, you're perceiving. And that unfiltered perception feels both alien and familiar, like remembering something ancient you'd been trained to forget. It can't be forced, and it can't be prolonged by will. The moment announces itself through a visceral sensation, a still point inside motion. You might feel it as the air thickening, or as a sudden transparency of thought. Often, it's accompanied by a faint pulse of awe mixed with disorientation. The brain's default mode network, which maintains your sense of self, temporarily quiets down. You stop referencing yourself as observer, and experience floods in unmediated. The boundaries between perceiver and perceived blur, not into confusion but into directness. Imagine a pendulum at its highest arc, suspended for an instant before gravity reclaims it. That suspension is where the choice happens, not consciously, but experientially. The nervous system decides whether to return to predictive safety or to risk recalibration. It's like standing between two kinds of gravity, one familiar, one deeper, both pulling in opposite directions. The exact moment is the hinge between them. If you surrender to it, without labeling, without trying to understand, the system begins its reorganization. Synaptic pathways that once ran on autopilot start to rewire for higher coherence. Sensory regions synchronize with emotional ones, creating new loops of integration. But if you resist, the moment collapses into confusion. The predictive brain floods back with corrective narratives. You're tired. You're anxious. This isn't real. The experience seals itself off, recorded as anomaly rather than revelation. That's why so few people ever realize it's measurable. On EEG scans, this moment appears as a transient burst of gamma synchronization, a brief harmony across distant regions of the brain, as if every neuron agreed on the same note for a heartbeat before returning to noise. Its coherence achieved not through control, but through release. You can't manufacture it, but you can recognize its texture. Time slows, attention sharpens, and for a breath, reality feels impossibly precise. Once you've felt it, even once, a subtle knowing stays with you. You begin sensing its approach in smaller ways, a sudden silence before decision, a glimpse of stillness between inhalation and exhalation. Each encounter reshapes your trust in perception. You start realizing that reality doesn't collapse when your mind lets go. It expands. And that expansion is not the end of stability. It's the birth of a new kind of solidity, one rooted in awareness instead of prediction. The beauty and the risk of the exact moment is that it cannot be remembered accurately. Memory belongs to the predictive mind, and this instant happens outside it. What you recall afterward is only its echo, a trace vibration in the nervous system that whispers, "Something real happened here." You can't replay it, but you can prepare your perception to notice it again. Through quiet attention, through the willingness to witness without immediately naming, you make yourself permeable to that alignment when it returns. Now, a small experiment. When was the last time you felt a sudden pause in perception, a flicker where everything seemed suspended, even for half a breath? Write it down in the comments. Don't analyze it. Just describe that instant. Where you were, what you felt, what the world seemed to do. That act of naming is itself a bridge, a way to anchor your awareness for the next time it happens. And if this resonated with you, take a second to like this. It's not about approval, it's about signaling to your own brain that you're ready to notice the next exact moment when reality hesitates before becoming solid again. You know that strange, aching sensation of being fully present, yet somehow detached. You're in the room, hearing the words, watching the gestures, but it all feels slightly displaced, like the emotional soundtrack is out of sync with the picture. That's not imagination. It's what happens when the brain's sensory integration falters for a fraction of a second. The circuitry that binds sight, sound, touch, and feeling together slips out of rhythm, and the world loses its emotional gravity. Neuroscience calls this a failure of multisensory binding. The emotional brain and the sensory brain are meant to dance in synchrony. The limbic system gives texture to perception, warmth to color, familiarity to voice, depth to memory. When they fall out of step, reality flattens. People describe it as dissociation, derealization, or simply the feeling of watching life through glass. But beneath the discomfort, something profound is unfolding. The system isn't breaking, it's recalibrating. It's trying to build a new coherence between what's felt and what's known. Emotion, in this sense, is not a reaction. It's a form of integration. It's how the brain ensures that sensory data carries meaning. When you see someone smile, you don't just register the geometry of a face. You feel the emotion embedded in it. That instant empathy is your brain synchronizing perception with prediction. When the synchronization fails, emotion lags behind the image. The smile is seen but not felt. The mind, suddenly deprived of its emotional compass, interprets the gap as alienation. This is why the experience feels so haunting. The body still receives input, but the meaning engine is offline. It's like reading a sentence where every word is correct, yet the syntax is missing. The coherence that gives experience its flavor, its sense of belonging, has gone temporarily silent. The more you try to force connection, the more elusive it becomes, because forcing belongs to the predictive mind, not the integrative one. And yet, This temporary disconnection has a function. It's a reset window for emotional circuitry. During sensory overload or cognitive stress, the brain temporarily dampens limbic feedback to prevent overwhelm. You feel detached not because you've lost emotion, but because the system is protecting itself while reordering information. The quiet that follows, the sense of emptiness, is the nervous system waiting for the new emotional architecture to lock into place. That's why, moments later, feelings often surge back all at once, as if the body had been holding its breath. If you listen closely to that interval, you'll notice subtle markers of realignment. A single sound becomes unbearably vivid, the rustle of fabric, the ticking of a clock, the rhythm of your own pulse. These details are not distractions. They're the first threads of reintegration. Each sensory anchor invites emotion back into contact with perception. It's how your system tests the edges of reconnection. The world begins to regain density, not through thought, but through embodied noticing. From a physiological angle, this reintegration corresponds to the reactivation of the insula, the brain region that bridges bodily awareness and emotion. When the insula comes back online, you feel yourself again. You're no longer observing your experience, you're inhabiting it. That's why even small acts of grounding, touching a surface, breathing through the soles of your feet, focusing on the temperature of the air, can trigger sudden emotional return. You're reuniting sense and self at the point where they parted. But here's the quiet revelation. The disconnection you fear is also a teacher. It exposes how emotion and perception are not separate systems, but two currents of one field. To feel disconnected is to glimpse the machinery that normally hides beneath experience. You're watching your consciousness reboot in real time. The moment you stop trying to fix the sensation and simply observe it, the system finds its own coherence again. The emotion doesn't return as it was, it returns deeper, slower, truer. And yet, this coherence is not permanent. Once the brain learns it can detach and return, it begins to test the threshold more often. It's as if perception itself becomes curious about its own structure. Each cycle of disconnection and reconnection refines awareness. You start to notice the subtlest transitions, the microsecond when emotion reattaches to meaning, when the world regains its temperature. That sensitivity is not fragility, it's precision. And soon, as this precision increases, something new appears at the edge of awareness, a reconfiguration mode, a mechanism your brain uses to adapt perception to realities it hasn't yet learned to predict. When the brain passes through instability and returns to coherence, it doesn't simply restore balance. It upgrades its model of the world. The disconnection you felt before was the system's way of collecting new information that didn't fit your previous assumptions. Once reintegration begins, the nervous system enters what neuroscientists sometimes call a reconfiguration mode, a natural adaptive process where perception rewrites its internal algorithms. It's not mystical, it's biology learning from contradiction. Every perception is a hypothesis. Your brain constantly tests these hypotheses against reality, and when they fail, it triggers a recalibration. The fascinating part is that the correction feels rewarding. Deep in the midbrain, the ventral tegmental area releases a subtle pulse of dopamine, not the flood associated with pleasure, but a microdose tied to learning. This is the micro-reward, a physiological acknowledgement that you've successfully integrated new data into your predictive system. In other words, your awareness has evolved, and your body celebrates it quietly. Think of this like tuning an instrument after a storm. Each time you re-establish coherence, the system resonates a little cleaner. Your perception becomes sharper, not because the world changed, but because your internal filters did. These tiny surges of dopamine and acetylcholine aren't just chemical side effects, they're the body's way of encoding adaptability as satisfaction. It's how nature ensures that awareness, even when painful, remains self-reinforcing. The nervous system rewards expansion, not comfort. Applied science calls this error-driven plasticity. When prediction errors occur, the brain's reward circuits engage to mark the new pattern as valuable. That's why the small moments of clarity after disorientation feel disproportionately peaceful. They're not coincidences, they're feedback loops. You've survived perceptual uncertainty, extracted information from it, and the system has logged that as progress. Over time, this creates a quiet addiction, not to pleasure, but to truth. Your biology begins to prefer accuracy over illusion, coherence over familiarity. You can work with this mechanism deliberately. When the next wave of instability comes, when the world feels slightly too bright, too distant, too unsteady, resist the reflex to shut down. Instead, slow your breath and distribute attention through your senses. The pressure of your feet on the ground, the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, the ambient hum around you. Each sensory anchor feeds the brain with reliable data. This stabilizes the predictive model and triggers micro-reward sequences that reinforce balance. In essence, you're teaching your nervous system how to learn safely from uncertainty. This approach aligns with what modern neuroscience describes as interoceptive training, the art of synchronizing inner and outer data streams. When you consciously attend to sensory input without judgment, the insular anterior cingulate and prefrontal cortex begin communicating more efficiently. They start tracking the mismatch between perception and emotion with precision instead of panic. Over time, this rewiring reduces reactivity and increases resilience. You're not escaping the instability, you're metabolizing it into insight. What's remarkable is that the system doesn't need grand gestures to evolve. A few seconds of focused awareness can shift entire neural patterns. The act of noticing without resistance, what contemplative traditions have practiced for centuries, is simply the predictive brain in repair mode. When you stay with the process long enough, your baseline perception changes. The world doesn't appear softer because you've lost grip on it. It appears softer because your nervous system no longer needs to over-predict to feel safe. Certainty relaxes, making space for nuance. This is the scientific face of what many spiritual traditions have called awakening. It's not enlightenment in the cosmic sense, it's cognitive efficiency in its purest form. A brain that has learned to reward accuracy instead of defense begins to perceive more layers of reality simultaneously. Subtle patterns that once hid behind habituation become visible, emotional undercurrents in conversation, unspoken intentions in silence, the fine texture of presence in stillness. These are not supernatural abilities, they're the natural result of predictive refinement. The beauty of this process is its self-propelling nature. Each successful cycle of destabilization and reintegration builds confidence. The next time you feel the tremor of unreality, a small voice inside recognizes it. I know this pattern. That recognition releases another microdose of reward, a neurochemical signal of trust. The system begins to perceive instability not as failure, but as opportunity. Reality feels less threatening because adaptation has become familiar. And once familiarity itself dissolves into curiosity, perception is ready for its next evolution, a deeper break from common sense, a turning point where what once seemed like collapse begins to reveal itself as expansion. What if the sensation that reality is losing solidity isn't a sign of collapse, but the first hint that you're beginning to perceive more of it? What if the ground under your perception doesn't vanish at all? It widens. The twist, hidden in plain sight, is that the world isn't becoming unstable. You are becoming transparent enough to see the mechanisms that once held it together. The structure that seemed to dissolve was never the world's. It was your prediction of it. This reversal changes everything. The so-called cracks in perception are not breaks in reality, but windows into its depth. Each moment of disorientation reveals a layer of processing you usually overlook. How light constructs meaning, how memory edits the present, how emotion colors the simplest observation. When the predictive system loosens, the mind stops compressing experience into manageable symbols. For a brief time, you perceive without abbreviation. That clarity feels overwhelming because you're encountering raw data, reality before translation. It's counterintuitive because the human brain evolved for efficiency, not accuracy. It trims complexity to keep you functional. But when the trimming pauses, the unfiltered world floods in. The edges of things shimmer with excess detail. Sounds carry emotional frequencies you've never noticed. Even silence thickens, alive with information. At first, this abundance feels like instability. Only later, when your awareness adjusts, do you realize that what you called loss of solidity was actually an increase in dimensionality. You weren't losing the world, you were gaining more of it. This is where the old equation between safety and certainty begins to invert. Certainty had always been your comfort because it promised stability, but it was also the barrier that limited perception to what could be predicted. The twist is that freedom hides on the other side of uncertainty. When you no longer demand that the world stay predictable, your senses begin to detect the subtle symphony of constant change underneath. Every sound, every movement, every glance becomes data alive with nuance. Reality, it turns out, was never static. It was only your perception that held it still. From a neuroscientific lens, this shift is measurable. During moments of expanded perception, neural activity becomes less localized. Instead of rigid dominance by prefrontal control, there's a distributed coherence, a state some researchers call global integration. Networks that usually compete for attention begin to synchronize. The brain stops passing reality into separate channels and starts processing it as a unified field. You experience that as stillness, but it's not still. It's highly ordered motion. You're perceiving the entire orchestra instead of just your instrument. Emotionally, this expansion translates into a paradoxical calm. You're aware of more, but reactive to less. The nervous system has learned that change doesn't equal threat. What once triggered alarm now feels like revelation. The pulse of life, with all its unpredictability, begins to feel trustworthy. It's as though you've been living under fluorescent light and suddenly step into daylight. Too bright at first, but undeniably real. The illumination burns through pretense and shows you how much of your former reality was scaffolding made of expectation. You can test this directly. Notice how, after one of those destabilizing episodes, your awareness sharpens. Your attention becomes panoramic yet precise. You're not dissociated, you're decentered. The self that used to mediate experience has softened, allowing perception to spread wider. The mind hasn't lost control. It has stopped pretending it was ever in control. This surrender doesn't shrink you. It enlarges the field through which life is felt. The collapse was never an ending. It was the clearing of noise for a higher signal to emerge. In this light, predictive instability isn't a malfunction, but a developmental phase. Just as vision must blur before it refocuses, consciousness must destabilize before it can expand its range. The system is evolving toward perceptual hypercoherence, a state in which emotion, focus, and interpretation synchronize without conflict. It's not perfection, it's fluency. You're learning to translate reality in real time instead of through memory, and that's where the next threshold forms, the forbidden alignment, the exact configuration where perception, emotion, and meaning lock into harmony so rare it almost feels illegal to notice. There exists a state so rare, so precise in its balance, that most minds never stabilize long enough to witness it. It happens when the machinery of perception, emotion, and interpretation synchronize into a single, seamless event. The brain stops alternating between feeling and thinking, sensing and naming. Everything aligns for a fraction of a heartbeat, and reality flows through unfiltered. It's called perceptual hypercoherence, but among those who study altered awareness, it carries another name, the forbidden alignment. Why forbidden? Because the mind is not designed to stay here. The alignment exposes too much truth too quickly. It reveals how your sense of self is not a fixed point, but a choreography between attention and sensation. When those two merge perfectly, the observer dissolves, and perception becomes self-aware. The illusion of separation, the line between you and what you perceive, vanishes. Most people retreat immediately. The nervous system interprets it as annihilation. But what actually disappears is not being, it's the barrier to it. In this alignment, emotion ceases to be reaction and becomes resonance. You don't feel about something, you feel with it. The frequencies of attention and environment overlap, creating a coherence so delicate that the ordinary sense of control evaporates. It's the closest the human system comes to total transparency. No agenda, no filter, no delay between signal and meaning. Everything that exists seems to articulate itself through you. The mind is not thinking, it's being thought by reality. From a scientific perspective, this moment resembles what neurodynamics describes as transient global synchrony. Different cortical regions, visual, emotional, cognitive, oscillate in phase for a few milliseconds, forming a unified rhythm. Consciousness becomes integrative rather than hierarchical. There's no top-down control, no bottom-up noise, only flow. For that instant, complexity simplifies into coherence. Subject and object fuse, not in mysticism, but in neurobiology's purest efficiency. It's difficult to describe because language fractures under its weight. Words depend on duality, this and that, me and you, but the forbidden alignment erases duality's grammar. The world doesn't appear to you, it is you perceiving itself. The air feels sentient. Time stretches not because it slows, but because there's no longer a gap between perception and comprehension. You are simultaneous with what you experience. It's an impossible precision, and it cannot be maintained. The brain reverts almost instantly, unable to metabolize that level of information without reasserting separation. Still, the residue remains, the afterglow of having once seen through the veil of prediction. What makes this alignment so difficult to reach is that it requires paradox, deep surrender and deep awareness at once. Any effort collapses it, any passivity drifts away from it. It's a point where consciousness balances perfectly between engagement and release, like a needle suspended in still air. The moment attention tries to grasp it, coherence disintegrates. The system resets to dual perception because survival depends on distinction. Yet every glimpse recalibrates the baseline. After experiencing this alignment, even fleetingly, ordinary reality feels slightly more transparent, as if light now carries memory. Emotionally, the forbidden alignment doesn't feel euphoric. It feels inevitable. There's no ecstasy, only clarity. Every sensation, even discomfort, appears as data perfectly in place. Nothing needs correction. The mind recognizes that meaning was never constructed. It was intrinsic all along. What you called confusion was simply too much information arriving too quickly for a divided mind to integrate. When the division falls away, understanding ceases to be effort. Knowing is replaced by being aware of knowing. Few ever realize that this alignment is accessible not through transcendence, but through precise attention to the present moment. It's not induced. It's revealed when the predictive brain finally stops trying to protect its version of reality. That's why it's so elusive. The very act of seeking it reinforces the separation that hides it. The key lies in neutrality, in allowing perception to meet the world without needing to define it. When that neutrality matures, alignment happens on its own, unannounced, unprovoked. And then, almost as quickly as it arrives, it passes. The predictive mind reactivates, the sense of I reforms, and the ordinary world reappears. But it doesn't feel quite as solid as before. You've seen its inner architecture, how attention bends it, how emotion colors it, how thought anchors it. That insight is irreversible. Once the forbidden alignment has brushed against your awareness, every future perception carries its echo. And in that echo lives a quiet promise that there is a moment coming soon when perception will reorganize completely and the solidity of reality will never feel the same again. There comes a point where perception can no longer return to what it once was. The process that began as a flicker of dissonance now reaches full coherence, a state not of peace, but of irreversible expansion. The forbidden alignment doesn't end with vision. It ignites transformation. Once the system tastes that level of clarity, it begins to reorganize every internal process around it. What you once called reality starts to feel like an echo of itself. Solidity remains, but it's porous now, luminous around the edges, as if meaning radiates from inside objects rather than being projected onto them. At this stage, prediction and perception stop alternating. They fuse. The brain no longer races to confirm its model of the world because it no longer needs the illusion of control. It finally trusts the directness of experience. The self, instead of sitting behind the eyes interpreting, becomes an organ of translation, fluid, participatory, alive inside every frame of awareness. You don't observe reality anymore, you conduct it. The orchestra that once played inside your skull expands to include everything you can sense. The world is not happening to you, it's happening with you. Neuroscience describes this phase as high-frequency coherence, fast, efficient communication across neural networks that used to compete for dominance. Emotion, cognition, and sensory input now share bandwidth. There's no hierarchy, no delay between what's felt and what's understood. It's the neural equivalent of transparency, thought without friction. The energy that once went into maintaining boundaries between self and other, subject and object, inside and outside, is released into awareness itself. That release feels like intensity, sometimes even ecstasy. But what it truly is efficiency. Consciousness operating at full bandwidth. And yet this expansion is not gentle. The mind experiences it as a form of death, because the old predictive architecture dissolves under the weight of coherence. What's dying, though, isn't identity, it's rigidity. The tension that kept perception stable is gone, and the system must learn to function in open fluidity. This is why people describe post-alignment awareness as simultaneously liberating and terrifying. There's no going back to the comfort of automatic perception. Every sensation now arrives alive, unmediated, almost too real. Even silence hums with intelligence. The climax of this transformation is paradoxical: stillness inside motion. The outer world continues as it always has, the same walls, same faces, same sounds, but you perceive its scaffolding differently. Everything seems to participate in a single rhythm, an invisible coherence threading through form and emptiness alike. It's as if the universe breathes through you. When this rhythm stabilizes, fear no longer registers in the same frequency. The nervous system recognizes impermanence not as loss, but as continuity. Change becomes the new constant, and the mind finally stops mistaking movement for instability. If you could witness this neurologically, you'd see the oscillations of the brain synchronizing across hemispheres, gamma and theta waves coupling, generating both clarity and calm. It's a biological signature of integration, the analytical and intuitive functions merging into one continuous circuit. The experience feels luminous, not because of light, but because attention itself has become radiant. You are not perceiving brightness, you are the brightness perceiving. But this state carries a quiet cost. Once your perception reorganizes, the ordinary solidity of the world never returns. You can pretend it does, but deep down, you know it's only texture, an interface. You've glimpsed the fluid substrate behind appearances, and it whispers through every moment afterward. Time, emotion, thought, they all feel like extensions of the same current. The division between inner and outer is permanently thinner. The illusion of separateness remains functional. You still act, decide, speak, but it's translucent now. Life unfolds through you, not around you. This is the true escalation, not a burst of transcendence, but the steady realization that consciousness has redefined its coordinates. The observer and the observed have traded places so many times that the distinction has worn away. What you once experienced as reality is now a collaboration, matter and meaning co-arising in real time. The old predictive mind, the one terrified of uncertainty, becomes obsolete. It doesn't vanish. It integrates as a servant of awareness rather than its master. You are still human, but the architecture of perception has evolved. And right at this peak, when the nervous system achieves its new equilibrium, there's a curious calm. It's not relief, it's recognition. You realize that you only noticed this whole transformation once, the precise instant before reality stopped feeling solid. Because after that, solidity itself became transparent. The evolution isn't an ending, it's the redefinition of what real means. And as the system settles into this new coherence, something even stranger begins to emerge. not another collapse, but the quiet intelligence of alignment, learning how to stay. The moment reality stopped feeling solid was never a breakdown, it was an upgrade. What you felt as dissonance was your brain learning to stop defending its predictions and start aligning with what's truly here. That's the forbidden alignment. The second your perception stops fighting change and begins translating truth directly. Every breath, every sound, every pulse of awareness from now on is part of that new coherence. Reality didn't dissolve. You became capable of perceiving more of it. If you made it to the end of this journey, write "I crossed the moment" in the comments so I'll know you've experienced this shift consciously. And if this exploration resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one deepens a different layer of perception and continues this evolution of awareness.